You were never meant to hear this. And once you do, there's no going back. In the quiet hills of Kentucky, where the fog rolls heavy and the fields breathe with an ancient stillness, there exists a story so deeply buried that even the state archives tremble to reveal it. Over 27 years, 312 men, women, and children vanished from a single religious community. Not lost, not relocated. Vanished, as if consumed by the earth itself. Pleasant Hill, they called it. The Shaker settlement that outsiders described as orderly, pure, and devoted. Whitewashed houses, straight rows of gardens, the sound of hymns at sunrise. It looked like a sanctuary, but appearances deceive, for behind those pristine walls was a system so perfected in control, so insidious in its design, that it would take less than a generation to erase hundreds of lives without leaving behind a single confession. Ask yourself this: how does an entire town disappear, and no one is punished? How does a government seal records for nearly 2 centuries, insisting the truth remain locked? That silence isn't ignorance, it's protection. Someone wanted this story hidden. Someone needed the machinery of Pleasant Hill, and the dark network that fed from it, to remain untouched. At the center was a family, the Richardsons. They did not build a community, they built a cage, and every soul who entered became a piece of their machinery, monitored, broken, reshaped. It was not religion, it was programming, psychological warfare disguised as worship. The men became labor, the women became instruments. And the children were currency. This is the kind of story that stains a man's soul once he hears it, because you start to notice the patterns. Not just in one vanished community, but in how institutions everywhere keep their flock obedient. The blueprint written in Kentucky would be mirrored in schools, governments, corporations, even digital systems today. Different faces, same design. Before we go further, you need to understand this descent is not entertainment. It's initiation. Once you know what happened at Pleasant Hill, you cannot unknow it. The questions will haunt you, the truths will echo in your own life. That's the price of opening this door. When Pleasant Hill was first founded in 1807, it was marketed as a sanctuary from the corruption of the outside world. America was burning with revivalism, the Second Great Awakening, a fever of faith that swept ordinary men and women into new sects promising salvation. People came desperate, broken, grieving, widowers who lost their families to disease, farmers who lost their land, women running from abusive homes, and the Richardsons offered them something irresistible: structure, belonging, purity. But purity, in their hands, was poison. Every step inside Pleasant Hill was engineered. From the moment you arrived, they stripped you of self, your clothing replaced with plain Shaker garb, your hair cut and ordered, your possessions surrendered. Even your name could be altered to remove worldly attachment. You were not a man anymore. You were a number in a system. Each convert underwent an indoctrination ritual lasting months. They called it spiritual cleansing, but it was closer to psychological demolition. Sleep was shortened. Work was doubled. Your movements watched. Your conversations reported. You were pushed into confession circles where doubt was called sin and submission was holiness. Slowly, you forgot who you were before, and when that final barrier broke, when you no longer asked why, the Richardsons knew you were theirs. To outsiders, Pleasant Hill looked like a miracle. Perfectly aligned gardens, clean white homes, hymns echoing at dusk. To visitors, it seemed like proof that God's kingdom could be built on earth. But what they didn't see was how the smiles were rehearsed, how every hand clasp was monitored, how every child was trained not to speak certain words in front of strangers. It wasn't harmony, it was theater, a performance to mask captivity. And this captivity wasn't passive. The Richardsons had perfected surveillance decades before modern intelligence agencies. Spies among the members, journals read by leadership, every letter in or out forged, censored, or destroyed, even their sacred communal property. System wasn't about faith. It was about centralizing wealth, feeding resources into one family's hands. You might think this sounds extreme, impossible. But look around you. Do you believe control like this vanished with the 1800s? Or has it only evolved, dressed in new language, hidden behind digital screens instead of hymnals? Pleasant Hill was not an exception. It was a prototype. The first cracks appeared quietly. A merchant named Thomas Whitman, respected, devout, the kind of man Pleasant Hill displayed proudly to visitors, began asking questions. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't rebellious. He was careful. He noticed the numbers didn't add up. Food supplies for 400 members, yet only enough meals served for 250. Workshop records that listed 50 craftsmen, but only 37 were ever seen working. Profits from seed sales that vanished between the fields and the ledgers. For most men, doubts wither in silence. But Thomas spoke aloud. In a public meeting, he asked where the money was going, why the records contradicted themselves, why souls on the membership lists didn't appear at meals. The hall went still. Members shifted nervously, and the Richardsons, the family who controlled everything, didn't scold him, didn't strike him down. They smiled. They called him troubled, weary, in need of spiritual rest. That night, Thomas drank a cup of tea prepared by Sister Hannah. By morning, he was dead. They said his passing was peaceful, his doubts confessed, his spirit purified. But Sister Mary Caldwell, who cleaned the dormitories, noticed something strange, a bitter almond smell, the bluish tint of fingernails, foam at the mouth. Signs of poison. She saw Brother Caleb burning Thomas's papers in the fireplace that same evening. His careful calculations, his ledgers, his evidence, gone to ash. And yet, what terrified Mary most wasn't the murder. It was the silence that followed. No one questioned, no one whispered. Within days, Thomas's name was erased from records, his belongings distributed, his memory folded into sermons as a cautionary tale. Doubt leads to destruction. In Pleasant Hill, reality itself could be rewritten. From that moment on, disappearances began to follow a pattern. Anyone who asked to leave, anyone who pressed too hard about numbers or dared mention family beyond the walls, they would fall into spiritual crisis. They would drink a certain tea, and then they would vanish. Officially, they had moved on or died in grace. Unofficially, their graves were unmarked, their records falsified, their families deceived. By the time outsiders noticed, over 300 names had dissolved into nothing. No bodies, no inquiries, just silence. The perfect crime, executed under the banner of faith. And here's the truth most men never want to admit. Pleasant Hill was not just killing bodies. It was killing identity itself. By 1815, the system was perfected. Death was no longer an interruption at Pleasant Hill. It was part of the ritual. When a member asked too many questions, leadership declared it a spiritual fracture. They would be separated, isolated, prayed over, and given remedies from the kitchen. Teas laced with substances that slowed the body, weakened the will, dulled the tongue. Those who resisted further disappeared quickly. The community didn't see these vanishings as murder. That was the brilliance of the Richardsons. They reframed it. They told the flock that anyone who fell into crisis was undergoing a final test. Either they transcended doubt and were taken to the Lord, or they gave themselves fully to the community, reborn as examples of obedience. To question the fate of the missing was to confess your own lack of faith. Silence wasn't just survival, it was piety. Sermons weaponized the memory of the lost. Do not become like Brother Thomas. Samuel would thunder, his voice echoing against the whitewashed beams. He let worldly numbers corrupt his spirit. God removed him for his own good. The congregation would nod, eyes downcast, whispering prayers to avoid the same fate. Doubt became a disease. Fear became holiness. Outsiders, when they visited, were shown carefully rehearsed scenes. Well-fed workers in fields, shiny furniture in workshops, songs of joy spilling from the chapel. If they asked about the dwindling numbers, Richardson elders explained that many converts simply left, returning to family, seeking other callings. The deception was seamless because the paperwork matched the story. Sister Patience, the youngest Richardson, forged letters in the handwriting of the vanished. Families received cheerful notes claiming their loved ones had chosen a new life elsewhere. Some even received counterfeit signatures on property deeds, transferring land back into the community's control. This was not chaos, it was administration, a ledger of human souls, balanced by ink and poison. Every disappearance recorded, covered, repurposed for gain, and every survivor conditioned to accept it. Over time, members no longer even noticed the vanishings. New converts replaced the dead. Daily routines erased the empty beds. Life marched forward in perfect order. And that was the most chilling truth of all. Pleasant Hill did not simply hide murder. It normalized it, sanctified it, turned it into a sacrament. 312 lives dissolved across 27 years, and the machinery of faith disguised every act as holy necessity. Inside the walls of Pleasant Hill, control was absolute. But what ensured its survival for nearly 3 decades was the family's reach beyond the community. Samuel Richardson understood something most zealots never grasp: isolation breeds suspicion. To survive, Pleasant Hill had to appear not closed off, but exemplary, a model of pious discipline that civic leaders could hold up as proof that religion built order out of chaos. Brother Nathan, Samuel's younger brother, was the diplomat. He mingled with sheriffs, judges, and merchants. He donated community produce to local churches. He sent funds to nearby schools. He hosted dinners for county officials, where Pleasant Hill's wine and food softened the doubts of anyone tempted to probe too deeply. These gestures weren't charity. They were investments. Subtle bribes that bought silence. When the whispers of missing people began to circulate, Sheriff William Morrison of Mercer County became one of their greatest shields. To him, the Richardsons presented themselves as guardians of morality, keeping hundreds of men and women disciplined and productive, never burdening the county with crime or poverty. What sheriff wouldn't want a community like that on his land? Morrison dismissed complaints from distant relatives who came searching for loved ones. They left of their own free will. He'd say, "The Shakers are peculiar, but harmless." He believed it, because the Richardsons made sure he did. Trade routes strengthened the illusion. Brother Isaiah's seed business stretched across 3 states, making Pleasant Hill indispensable to regional farmers. Brother Jeremiah's furniture became a prized export, its quality unmatched. Money flowed outward. Respect flowed back. Who would question a community that fed counties, furnished parlors, and filled church coffers? Pleasant Hill wasn't hidden in the shadows. It was woven into Kentucky's prosperity. Even the forged letters that Sister Patience crafted played into this web of protection. Families in Ohio, Tennessee, and Virginia received carefully written updates from relatives who were, in truth, long dead. Those letters reassured them. "I've moved on. I've found peace. I won't be coming back." Relatives stopped asking questions. Lawyers stopped pursuing inheritance claims. Outsiders silenced by ink. This was the genius of Pleasant Hill. Murder was hidden not by secrecy, but by performance. To the outside world, the Shaker community was a beacon of purity. To the inside, it was a prison with walls built from fear, lies, and influence. And as long as the Richardsons controlled both the stage and the script, the play continued without interruption. If the disappearances were the body of Pleasant Hill's machinery, indoctrination was its beating heart. The Richardsons knew that fear alone cannot sustain obedience forever. Fear cracks. Fear leaks. But if you strip away a man's inner world and rebuild him from the ground up, he won't need chains. He'll become his own warden. The process began immediately upon arrival. New converts were greeted with kindness, soft voices, and the illusion of safety. They were offered rest from their worldly burdens, food, and prayer circles that surrounded them in warmth. But within days, the test began. Sleep shortened, work doubled, questions discouraged. Their former names called less and less until they were addressed only as brother or sister, indistinguishable from anyone else. Individuality dissolved like sugar in water. Sister Rebecca oversaw what she called soul realignment. She was skilled in reading weakness, knowing exactly which grief to press, which fear to amplify. To widows, she whispered that their lost husbands awaited them in heaven if they remained faithful. To young men, she promised that their sinful urges would vanish through holy labor. Every confession was written down, every secret cataloged. These vulnerabilities became chains, ready to be pulled at any time. Children were the easiest to mold. Families surrendered them at the gate, convinced they were offering their offspring to God's work. The Richardsons saw them as blank slates. Boys were trained into tireless laborers, their play replaced with endless tasks. Girls were taught silence, obedience, and the skill of watching without speaking. Children became currency, proof of the community's growth, leverage against parents who considered leaving, and future instruments of the system's continuity. And here lies the darkest truth: indoctrination at Pleasant Hill did not erase rebellion, it redirected it. Members weren't broken into submission. They were rewired to believe that obedience was rebellion against Satan, that silence was courage, that surrender was strength. A man convinced of this would police himself. A woman shaped by this would report her own husband if his doubts wavered. Children raised in this cage never knew the taste of freedom, so they never thought to seek it. This wasn't religion. This was programming. And once a mind was rebuilt to Richardson specifications, it wasn't just compliant. It was loyal. Even as bodies vanished around them, members did not see murder. They saw divine order. Pleasant Hill had achieved the dream of every empire, every tyrant, every manipulator of men, obedience without question. If indoctrination rewired the mind, surveillance ensured it never strayed. At Pleasant Hill, there were no locked cells, no visible shackles, no guards with whips. The Richardsons understood that true control came not from force, but from the sense that every breath was observed, every thought weighed, every mistake recorded. It began with confession. Twice a week, members were required to bear their sins aloud before a gathering. What seemed like spiritual cleansing was, in truth, data collection. Every doubt spoken, every slip admitted, every secret exposed was documented by the elders. A man who confessed to dreaming of escape would find himself watched at meals, assigned new work details, paired with informants. A woman who admitted discontent would be reminded, in private, of her spiritual weakness. A warning she was being measured for removal. Children were trained as eyes. They were told that reporting misbehavior was an act of holiness, a way to save a soul from damnation. A boy who heard his father whisper doubts might run to the elders, convinced he was protecting the family from Satan. A girl who noticed her mother hoarding bread could earn public praise for loyal vigilance. Betrayal was sanctified. Families fractured under the weight of watching one another, never knowing who would be the next informer. But the most insidious layer of surveillance was internal. Through sermons, songs, and endless repetition, members were taught that God saw everything, that stray thoughts were as dangerous as spoken blasphemy. Samuel Richardson hammered this doctrine with terrifying precisions. There are no secrets in the house of the Lord. To think against us is to think against God himself. Doubt wasn't just rebellion, it was eternal damnation. In time, members stopped speaking their questions, then stopped even thinking them. Surveillance no longer required spies, because every soul became its own jailer. The architecture of Pleasant Hill, narrow corridors, shared dormitories, open workshops, erased privacy. Solitude was impossible. The only place left untouched was the silence of one's own mind, and even that space was poisoned by fear. This was not simply oversight. It was psychological warfare. The Richardsons did not need whips or chains, because the flock carried their own. The missing did not vanish because they were caught trying to escape. They vanished because their own community delivered them, convinced it was righteous. And thus Pleasant Hill thrived, not as a village of believers, but as a hive of watchers. Each one a prisoner, each one a warden. Fear at Pleasant Hill was never left to chance. It was staged, rehearsed, and ritualized into spectacle. The Richardsons understood the psychology of theater. Terror is most effective when it is shared, when the group witnesses it together, and when it carries the weight of sacred meaning. Every month, the community gathered in the meeting house for what was called the Circle of Purity. To an outsider, it might have looked like a solemn worship service. But to those inside, it was a trial. Members suspected of disobedience were brought before the congregation. They stood in silence as the elders read accusations, not crimes, but sins, laziness, doubt, hesitation in prayer, whispers after dark. Guilt was assumed. There was no defense. The punishment was not always death. Often it was humiliation. The accused were forced to kneel, while the congregation shouted hymns louder and louder, drowning them in sound until their body trembled. Others were assigned penances, days of labor without food, weeks of silence, or endless repetitions of scripture until their voice broke. Children were sometimes ordered to chant verses against their own parents, shaming them before the crowd. These rituals tore apart bonds of trust and reboot them into chains of obedience. Yet death was always present, a shadow behind every ceremony. When an accused failed to repent, they were quietly taken away. The congregation never saw the act itself, but they heard the sermons afterward. Brother Thomas has been called home. Sister Miriam has been removed for her salvation. The absence was enough. The mystery was more powerful than the execution. Members filled the silence with their own fear, imagining the fate that awaited them if they faltered. Symbols reinforced the spectacle. Empty chairs were left in the meeting hall, reminders of those who had fallen. Graves were dug but never marked, visible from the fields yet nameless, ensuring that workers labored under the gaze of anonymous dead. Even the clothing of the vanished was repurposed, worn by new converts. A chilling signal that lives were interchangeable, that individuality was nothing but fabric to be stripped and reassigned. Through these orchestrated displays, Pleasant Hill became more than a community. It became a theater of control, where terror was dressed in scripture and cruelty was framed as love. Every hymn, every punishment, every silence whispered the same truth: resist, and you will vanish. And so the people obeyed, not because they were chained, but because they had seen what happens when the chain tightens. Behind the hymns and the sermons, Pleasant Hill ran on an engine of cold economics. The Richardsons were not simply zealots, they were shrewd businessmen who understood that faith could be converted into labor, and labor into wealth. Every ritual, every vanishing, every act of obedience had an economic shadow trailing behind it. Members owned nothing. The moment a convert joined, their property, farms, tools, animals, even family heirlooms, was signed over to the community. On paper, it was an act of devotion, surrendering earthly goods to God's kingdom. In reality, it was asset stripping. Over 3 decades, the Richardsons accumulated land across Kentucky, expanding their holdings far beyond the original settlement. The faithful poor became a labor force, and their sacrifices became revenue streams. The vanished, too, had their economic value. Their farms reverted to Pleasant Hill. Their wills were forged, leaving inheritance rights in the hands of the church. Sister Patience's false letters ensured families never contested these transfers. Believing their kin had left willingly, even death was monetized. Every disappearance was both a removal of descent and an acquisition of wealth. The work itself was relentless. Fields of corn, orchards heavy with fruit, herds of livestock, all tended by hands that never demanded wages. Days stretched from before sunrise to after dark, with only brief breaks for meals and prayer. The output was staggering. Seed stocks sold across 3 states, textiles that clothed entire towns, furniture that graced the parlors of Kentucky's wealthiest families. Pleasant Hill's name became synonymous with quality. Few suspected that its polish was built on blood. Trade partners never asked questions. They saw only the surfacey, a disciplined community, free of vices, producing goods with unmatched skill. They didn't see the hollow eyes of the workers who had lost children to the Lord's call, or the empty beds of those who had been erased. The Richardsons understood that the more respectable the product, the less anyone would suspect its origin. Prosperity became its own defense. Officials who might have investigated were silenced, not only by bribes, but by dependents. Pleasant Hill supplied food to towns during lean harvests, furniture to courthouses, seed to struggling farmers. To strike at the Richardsons would be to strike at the lifeline of the region. And so, the murders continued, hidden beneath the veneer of holy industry. The tragedy of Pleasant Hill was this: the more it killed, the richer it became. Death was not a secret cost. It was a business model. For nearly 3 decades, Pleasant Hill's system ran like clockwork, but no empire of silence lasts forever. By the early 1820s, small fractures began to appear, whispers too faint to ignore, suspicions too persistent to erase. The Richardsons could forge letters, silence dissent, and bribe officials, but they could not fully control memory. The living carried ghosts inside them, and those ghosts began to stir. It started with children. Some grew old enough to question the rituals they had been raised in. A boy named Eli, only 12, was caught asking why Brother Thomas never returned from the Lord's call. His punishment was swift days of labor in silence, stripped of food, but the question lingered. Others had noticed too: empty beds, tools left behind, voices missing from the songs. The unexplained absences piled up like stones in the conscience of the community. Families who had surrendered property years earlier began to write back, pressing for visits. The forged letters Sister Patience had crafted grew harder to sustain. Relatives arrived at the gates, asking to see their kin face to face. The Richardsons responded with rehearsed answers: "He has left us," or "She has taken the Lord's road elsewhere." But the unease grew. Outsiders might have turned away before, but now stories of vanished relatives were spreading across counties. Inside, even loyal members began to crack. Sister Miriam, once a model of obedience, was overheard muttering in her sleep, calling out the names of the missing. Brother Caleb secretly carved marks into a beam in the barn, one for every person who had vanished since his arrival. He counted 62. When another member discovered it, the marks were quickly planed away, the wood smoothed, but rumors spread that someone is keeping tally. The Richardsons responded with more spectacle, more rituals of fear, yet the harder they pressed, the more fragile their control became. Every punishment, every public shaming reminded the flock of what could not be spoken. Pleasant Hill was not just a home of faith. It was a graveyard with walls, and beyond those walls, the outside world was changing. America was swelling with new settlers, traders, and preachers. Information traveled faster, secrets grew harder to bury. The Richardsons did not yet know it, but the same silence that had preserved their rule for 30 years was beginning to rot. And when silence rots, it does not crumble quietly, it bursts. The first real crack in Pleasant Hill's armor came not from officials or merchants, but from a single trembling soul who slipped through the net of control. His name, at least the one he carried before the Richardsons erased it, was Isaac Brewer. A farmer's son from Virginia, he had joined the community with his parents as a boy. By the age of 24, Isaac had seen more vanishings than he could count. He had whispered the names of the missing to himself in secret, etching them into his memory like forbidden scripture. Isaac's breaking point came one night in 1823. He was assigned to help bury what the elders called a fallen brother. No funeral, no prayer, only the sound of shovels against earth under the moonlight. As he lowered the body, Isaac saw the face. It wasn't an old man succumbing to sickness, as he'd been told. It was Caleb, the one who carved tallies into the barn. His throat bore the unmistakable mark of rope. That night, Isaac fled. He carried nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of 30 years of secrets. For 3 days, he hid in forests, drinking from streams, evading patrols sent to bring him back. But he made it to Harrodsburg, 15 miles away, where he collapsed at the door of a tavern and begged to speak. What Isaac revealed shocked the townsfolk. He spoke of the vanishings, the ritualized trials, the forged letters. He described graves without names, children raised as spies, property seized in the name of God. At first, the crowd dismissed him as a bitter apostate. But then he listed names, dozens of them, some belonging to men and women known to have gone missing after joining the Shakers. When relatives in the room recognized them, silence spread like wildfire. The Richardsons were quick to respond. Within a week, letters circulated claiming Isaac was unstable, possessed by worldly spirits. Merchants loyal to Pleasant Hill dismissed his testimony as slander. Sheriff Morrison, long in the Richardsons' pocket, declared Isaac a liar and a fugitive. Yet the seed had been planted. Doubt, once spoken aloud, cannot be unsaid. Isaac vanished from public record soon after, whether by disappearance, death, or exile remains unclear. But his words survived, passed from ear to ear, tavern to tavern. He had given shape to the fear everyone else had only whispered. And once fear has a name, it begins to grow teeth. Isaac Brewer's words did not die with him. They spread like a contagion, whispered in taverns, traded in letters, and carried by travelers who had passed through Harrodsburg. At first, the stories were treated as drunken exaggerations, the kind of wild rumor frontier towns thrive on. But as names began to line up with real families who had lost sons, daughters, and kin to Pleasant Hill, the unease hardened into something far more dangerous: suspicion. By 1824, small groups of concerned relatives began pressing county officials for answers. Why had their family members never written back? Why were death certificates missing? Why were the Shakers so unwilling to allow unsupervised visits? The questions came slowly at first, but each one chipped away at the iron curtain the Richardsons had built. The family responded with precision. Nathan Richardson intensified his charm offensive, attending county meetings, donating funds for local schools and churches, even sponsoring road repairs. To officials, Pleasant Hill appeared as a beacon of moral order, a counterbalance to the lawless backwoods culture that plagued Kentucky. The more polished and generous the Richardsons appeared, the more suspicious dissenters seemed. Yet beneath that sheen, cracks deepened. A Methodist circuit preacher, Reverend Elijah Carter, began collecting testimonies from families who had lost relatives to the Shaker community. Unlike others, Carter had no fear of the Richardsons. He believed exposing their corruption was his divine mission. In fiery sermons, he accused Pleasant Hill of practicing spiritual cannibalism, consuming the lives of its members in the name of God. The accusations were shocking, but also vague, easy for the Richardsons to dismiss as sectarian rivalry. Still, Carter persisted. He began writing pamphlets, naming the missing, recording their ages, the dates they had entered Pleasant Hill, and the eerie silence that followed. His words spread through Kentucky's rural churches, igniting curiosity, then fear. By 1826, whispers reached even the state capitol in Frankfort. An inspector from Ohio, one of the few outsiders permitted to stay briefly within Pleasant Hill, filed a confidential report after noticing discrepancies in population numbers and food supplies. That report was buried in the archives almost as soon as it was written. For the first time, however, the Richardsons felt something they had long thought impossible: scrutiny. The fortress they had built of silence, piety, and manipulation was not impenetrable. A storm was gathering, and though it moved slowly, it promised to shake the foundations of Pleasant Hill itself. By the winter of 1827, the first outsiders arrived at Pleasant Hill under the guise of official inspection. 2 men from Lexington, one a county auditor, the other a physician, came with polite questions and the authority of state seals stamped on their papers. They were not enemies, at least not yet. But they were dangerous because they were curious. The Richardsons greeted them with a display of warmth and order that bordered on theater. Samuel led the visitors through spotless dormitories where men sang hymns at their looms, while women in pristine white bonnets hummed softly as they spun flax. Children, drilled beforehand, recited scriptures about purity and obedience. The auditors were impressed. It looked like paradise, a community without poverty, drunkenness, or crime, but the physician noticed details others missed. Too many of the men bore calluses not from farm work, but from restraints. A girl's smile faltered when Martha laid a hand on her shoulder, eyes darting like prey. In the infirmary, shelves of tinctures carried strange labels, and some were marked in a code the physician did not recognize. He asked about mortality rates, and Sister Patience Richardson produced records too neat, too perfect. The ink still fresh in places where it should have been decades old. The auditors pressed for the number of members currently residing at Pleasant Hill. Brother Ezekiel answered quickly, 412. But when the physician calculated food consumption compared to that figure, the numbers strained credibility. Ezekiel brushed it off, blaming fluctuations in trade, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The visitors left with conflicting impressions. One saw godly devotion, the other something far more sinister. When their reports reached Frankfort, they contradicted each other so sharply that the state chose the safer path in action. Officially, Pleasant Hill remained untouched, but rumors began to spread among lower officials. Rumors of missing death certificates, of sealed coffins that were never opened, of members who vanished from ledgers between one inspection and the next. And beyond Kentucky, newspapers in Ohio and Indiana carried faint whispers of a strange Shaker sect. That might not be what it claimed. The Richardsons felt the pressure tightening. They had survived descent within, but this was different. The outside world was circling, and in their nightly councils, the family came to a chilling decision. If scrutiny grew sharper, Pleasant Hill would not reform. It would retreat deeper into secrecy, and those who probed too far would simply disappear. By 1829, the Richardsons had perfected their response to scrutiny, silence it at the source. When Reverend Elijah Carter returned to Harrodsburg after preaching another fiery sermon against Pleasant Hill, he never made it home. His horse was found grazing along the road, saddle empty, reins tangled in brambles. Search parties combed the woods, but no body was ever recovered. His disappearance was whispered about in Kentucky for years, but without proof. The story faded like smoke. The physician from Lexington, who had raised questions about mortality rates, suffered a sudden stroke months later. His neighbors spoke of poison in hushed tones, but no evidence could be found. The county auditor, who filed a favorable report, meanwhile, received generous contracts through Richardson intermediaries, a reward for loyalty disguised as coincidence. The message was clear: those who resisted vanished, those who complied prospered. The pattern became almost invisible, because it looked like life itself. Accidents, illness, fortune, misfortune. Only those who stood close enough could see the deliberate hand guiding it all. Inside Pleasant Hill, the family tightened control. Members were forbidden to speak with visitors without a Richardson present. New converts underwent deeper psychological conditioning, their past identities shredded faster, their dependents rebuilt stronger. The children were trained as watchers, taught to memorize conversations, to repeat phrases back to Rebecca like confessions. The community became not just a place of worship, but an organism, one body, one mind, one will. Yet the rumors outside would not die. Farmers who did business with Isaiah Richardson whispered of wagons leaving the community at night, covered in tarps that sagged like they carried more than grain. Merchants swore that sometimes money changed, hands twice for the same goods, with one record kept for trade and another for the state. And in the back rooms of taverns, Isaac Brewer's story, though officially dismissed, grew into folklore. By 1830, men from Ohio and Indiana began forming what they called watch groups. Volunteers determined to keep track of Pleasant Hill. They didn't trust sheriffs, they didn't trust officials, and they began comparing notes. The missing names, the contradictory records, the sudden deaths. They all pointed to something monstrous hiding beneath the surface of religious purity. The Richardsons knew it too. They could feel eyes watching from the trees, hear rumors echoing in town halls. But instead of softening, they hardened. Their answer to pressure was always the same: control more tightly, silence more completely, strike more decisively. And in that tightening, Pleasant Hill crossed a threshold from secrecy into outright war against the truth itself. The end came not with fire or soldiers, but with silence. In 1834, after 27 years of absolute control, Pleasant Hill ceased to exist in a single season. Neighbors who had traded with them for decades noticed first. The wagons no longer arrived at market. The seed business fell quiet. The workshops stood idle. By midsummer, smoke no longer curled from the chimneys. When curious locals finally crossed the boundary in autumn, they found buildings intact, tables set with half-finished meals, tools laid neatly beside empty workbenches. But not a single living soul. 312 people had vanished as if swallowed by the earth. No bodies were found. No wagons departed. No letters explained. The records Sister Patience had so carefully forged were stacked in immaculate order. But they ended abruptly, mid-entry, as though the hand writing them had simply stopped. Beds were made, garments folded, gardens still blooming. Life appeared paused, not ended. The state of Kentucky sealed what little evidence existed, burying reports in archives that remained locked for nearly 2 centuries. Newspapers of the time barely mentioned the disappearance, dismissing it as the migration of a sect, as if hundreds of souls could simply walk away together and leave no trace. Officials had no desire to admit they had ignored years of warnings, no will to stir panic by suggesting an entire community could vanish overnight. Whispers persisted, though. Some claimed the Richardsons led their followers into the caves beneath the Kentucky hills, vanishing into an underground refuge where they could escape scrutiny forever. Others believed mass suicide, disguised as holy ascension, had ended them all. A darker rumor insisted the family had sold the community into shadow networks that thrived on human lives. A traffic of souls hidden behind scripture, but perhaps the most disturbing truth lies in the silence itself. Pleasant Hill did not simply vanish, it was erased. The state, the church, and even rival sects all found it more convenient to forget. To remember would mean admitting how deep corruption can run, how easy it is for men in authority to manipulate faith into chains. And so the story sleeps, buried in sealed files and whispered folklore. Yet here you are listening. And once a truth like this enters you, you cannot go back. The same silence that swallowed Pleasant Hill hovers over us still, waiting. The question is not whether they disappeared. The question is how many more communities, just like it, have already been buried in history. Their secrets hidden in plain sight.